Hi, I'm Xander, and today we're going to go over Negative Lab Pro inversions. It's a little different than the Color Perfect inversions. You'll find that there really is no perfect way to invert negatives. You can get great inversions from straight out of the scanner software sometimes. You can get great inversions from Negative Lab Pro, Color Perfect. The interesting thing about Negative Lab Pro is that it analyzes every single negative uniquely, and it does it in a way that is really different from any other software that's come before it. There's a really active forum on Facebook. It's called Negative Lab Pro Users. I would really recommend that you check it out and offer suggestions. I have made a number of suggestions to Nathan Johnson, the guy who runs the site and makes the program, and I've seen him implement all kinds of things that I've requested and other users have requested. He's really responsive, he's a really nice guy, and he's super on it in terms of helping you figure stuff out. One thing that's a big pet peeve of mine, if you go on the forum, search the Facebook group first before you ask this question that has probably been asked 25 times. Just search, because it's probably up there already. So first we're going to talk about DSLR scans. So this is a digital camera pointing at a light table. The tonal response curve of the camera versus the Imacon is just super different. So this is a 3F file, and this is a DSLR scan. So first we'll talk about the DSLR workflow, which is somewhat different than the Imacon workflow for Negative Lab Pro. So the first thing that we're going to do is go into the develop module and hit W, and this brings up your white balance picker. And go ahead, and you're definitely going to want to scan some of the negative film edge, because you're going to need to white balance on the film edge. And this lets Negative Lab Pro know that this is the thing to subtract out from everything else, because you've got to eliminate the orange mask whenever you're inverting. So it ends up being around anywhere from 2100 to like 2800 Kelvin, depending on what film stock you're using. And it also depends on the exposure. So to open Negative Lab Pro, you can either go to File, Plugin Extras, Negative Lab Pro, but just hit Control N, not Command, but Control, and it pops up with Negative Lab Pro here. You can see there's digital camera, which it's already detected that it is. Then here you have the pre-saturation. Usually I would leave this at the default, but if you find that it's too saturated, you can go this way, or if you find that it's not saturated enough, you go this way. The border buffer is really important. So it's going to analyze whatever is in this image. So that's going to include this, the light table here, and the film edge and everything else, and that's kind of going to screw it up. So for this, I would say probably about, 7% will probably exclude all the border that's here. But generally I'd recommend, just before you do Negative Lab Pro, just crop to the piece of film and just like a little outside to get the film edge, and then just use the border buffer for the rest. So in this case we'll go with 7%. Before you hit convert, you'll see there's a few different color models. What Negative Lab Pro is basing its algorithm on is it was invented largely to try to emulate the two major Minilab scanners. So there's something called a Frontier scanner, and there's something that's called a Noritsu scanner. There's a few different iterations of each, but essentially it's the type of scanner that if you send your film off to a lab and tell them to scan it, they shoot it through one of these scanners and it'll scan your whole roll in, a minute. And while the resolution isn't the highest and the tonal range isn't necessarily the widest, the colors are really good. The Noritsu is a little more clean, a little more sterile, a little more contrasty, a little more neutral. The Frontier inversions are a little softer, a little warmer, a little more vivid. a little more stylized. It also works great for black and white negatives, and so you can choose that as well. Basic is what I would use if you have a TIFF file. So basic is definitely good for IMACON scans, or if you've got old linear TIFF files from flatbed stuff, you know, the basic model is often the best choice for that. We're going to go ahead and convert here. So then as soon as you convert, it opens up into the edit window. Now these are the defaults here. You'll see, first of all, the tone setting. There's a bunch of different options for tone. All these ones that say lab, these are emulating what the Minilab scanner options are. When you scan with a Frontier or you scan with a Noritsu, they have these sort of the standard one, which is a little more punchy. They have like soft highlights, soft shadows, all soft, all hard, you know, these sort of ambiguous terms. Try them out, but if you're going the lab route, I generally would just stick with standard. The other options are these linear options. So it's got a very flat look to it. If I'm going that route, I usually go linear flat. If you're looking to use curves and stuff and really tailor your image in Photoshop, this is the option I would use. Or these ones, if you're into color grading in video, you like DaVinci or something like that, these will be familiar terms, namely the cinematic log, aka logarithmic curve. This is also a very flat sort of curve in a different way. It's flat, but it also sort of preserves the vibrance of the colors, as you can see. These are just different iterations. Cinematic flat is really good for preserving highlight detail. But I would encourage you to play around with all these. You know, oftentimes you can start out with the standard, and then before you do anything, play with the white balance options here. The auto color, neutral, warm, and cool are pretty much all the only ones I use. These other ones are sort of legacy options. In this case, this is sort of late afternoon light, and so I'm going to probably go with auto color warm. And then the third thing that I generally do is if this isn't working and I have a neutral, I will click the white balance picker here, go like this, and find a neutral area of my image and actually white balance on it. This is not going to work that well for this image because the light is so warm, and you know, if I try to make this cement here neutral, it's going to turn the whole thing kind of blue because this is supposed to be warm. And then finally, the Frontier lookup table is emulating the Frontier scanner. That's the default. The natural one takes the reds and the blues and brings them into gamut a little better. Now you'll notice that it didn't change right away. Sometimes it gets a little glitchy and you have to click another control or something to get it to shift. So now see how the sky has gone to more of a natural blue. And you can also increase the amount of the profile. So if you want it even more natural, you can turn it up to 150 or 200. And it will just continue to knock it down into a more regular spectrum. In this case, I'll probably go with 150 or so. There are also really good controls for color in the midtones, highlights, and shadows. The midtones are just one set of controls, as you'd imagine. The highlights have this range here that's really good, as do the shadows. And that's a really great tool because if you see like, oh well, these shadows are really blue, you can target them very specifically. So let's say that they're blue. I can add yellow, and you see if I crank the range up, it affects more and more of the image. But if you want to just affect the darker parts, you can turn the range down and it will just target it to the darkest parts of the image. But also, you'll notice that C-print shadows always go really cool. They are very apparently blue. And that's just part of the look. So actually, maybe I don't care. Maybe I'll leave it at 0 and let the shadows be kind of blue. Now, one thing you'll see about this negative, I put a big old hole in my negative. That's going to affect the way that it's seen by Negative Lab Pro, and no amount of border buffer is going to eliminate that. So you can try to invert it with it, but to be safe, I'd probably just crop it so that I get all the important tones in the image. Probably something like this. And then I'll hit Control N for Negative Lab Pro. And then I'll change the border buffer to 0 because I've already cropped out all the film edge. I want it to analyze the whole thing. Say OK. And I'll uncrop here, bring it out. And you can see that it has created a really different inversion. You can see the one on the left is the one where I cropped the hole. The one on the right is where I did not crop the hole. It's much cooler. The contrast isn't quite as full. It's got sort of more color casting going on to it. Now this one might be a little red or something. Everything's the same between the two. This one is just cropped out the hole and it's gotten a lot better. So I'm going to go over here. And the great thing about Negative Lab Pro is that it's all raw and it's adjusting the raw data in your image. So I can go in here and I can change stuff like the brightness and the contrast and the whatever I want. Make it all crazy. Say OK. And open up Negative Lab Pro again and all those settings are there. If you reset, it's going to reset everything, which is kind of annoying. This I want to keep. So I'm just going to go through here and just zero everything out. These soft lows option and soft highs option, I generally stay away from. These are sort of a legacy thing that Nathan made in the beginning, and they don't work as well as some of the other controls. If you look at the histogram, you can see the change. And you can see the shadows change slightly. You'll see the histogram here is moving a bit. But if you're trying to really bring back highlight detail, I would either use the lights here, or I would use the whites. And if it's something really bright that you're trying to get back, this white clip and black clip are amazing. They are for like really brights, like you're, getting detail back in like clouds and lamps and stuff like that. It's basically moving your black point or your white point. White clip works if you want to bring it back, you turn it negative. So usually -5 or so, you can see brings back a lot of highlight detail. And likewise, -5 in the shadows will bring back a lot of shadow detail. Not always necessary. Sometimes you'll find you want to bring it way down. If you want to go to like 10 and really clip the blacks, certain images need that. If you've got a cityscape or something, nightscape or whatever, and you want blacks, this program is designed to not clip any information. And sometimes that comes at the expense of the aesthetic that you're trying to get. So these are sort of manual overrides for demanding that it actually creates pure blacks or pure whites. Oftentimes just leaving them at zeroed out is fine. And generally, if you're trying to get tonal detail out of something like his face or whatever, I would definitely recommend using these controls first. And, I would encourage just playing around with all this stuff. So now we'll take a look at an IMACON scan and how that workflow goes. Things are a little different. See that the scan, like we talked about earlier, sort of looks different. The baseline scan looks different than DSLR scan. So let's jump into it. So another thing to note about IMACON scans is that sometimes you won't have film edge. And a lot of times, especially with the newest iteration of Negative Lab Pro, you don't need that. You don't even need to white balance on the film edge. And it's actually not recommended. Although if you are having a hard time, sometimes it does help to balance on the film edge. If you don't have film edge, you can actually go into a deep shadow like this and white balance there. So you can see, go like this, and we got -66, -40, and then if you do it on the actual film edge, you got almost the same thing. So if you white balance, you can then go here, and I'm going to show you the two different versions. I'm going to crop out that little hole in his head there. That will screw up the inversion, and I might as well just crop out the whole thing here. And just like I'm cropping out that hole in his head, you can crop out anything that's sort of an anomaly in your image. If you've got like one point that's like a bright incandescent light bulb, or you've got one point that's like totally dark and everything else isn't, or you've got, you know, this crazy red patch in your image or something that's screwing up the inversion, you might try just cropping that out and then re-inverting if you're having problems, because if you try to get it to focus on just the important parts of the image, sometimes those other things will end up screwing it up, so you can just crop them out. Right, and then I'll do Control N, and so for IMACON scans you can try basic. Go ahead and try these if you want, but a lot of times I'll just start with basic. Don't need any border buffer because I cropped out everything. Okay, so I got this, and if you make a virtual copy here, I'm going to go ahead, go back to convert. I'm going to say reset photo, which will undo all the Negative Lab Pro settings. And then I'm going to go and set this back to 0. And you can see now when we go to Negative Lab Pro and invert, you get something a little different. So all the same settings here, but you've got, this is without white balance before inverting, and this is with white balance before inverting. So in this case, I actually prefer the white balance, although, you know, you've got reds that are a little too extreme here, you know, and that's something you can try to balance out with the LUT, or you can do, you know, so it's too bright, so it'll also do that, you know, and you can go in and tune it as necessary. And IMACON scans are often going to take a little more work in Negative Lab Pro than DSLR scans, but it really depends on the image, because it's analyzing the image based on the content, so, you know, every negative is going to be a little different. A lot of the time, I'm just so used to linear scans from drum scanning, and so I'll go with like cinematic log or something like that, and you can see on the histogram we're getting pretty close to the shadows, so I'll go to the black clip here and go to maybe -5 or so, push it over a bit, get all the tonal detail here, bring down the lights a bit, and basically get something that's like fairly neutral, but is very flat, so we're not anywhere near clipping on either end. You know, white clip, maybe bring that down a bit, probably not that far, -2. And this is a really good place to start with Photoshop. So if you go like this, you go ahead and uncrop, go like that. Okay, make sure all your settings for external editing are right. TIFF, Adobe RGB, 16-bit, 360 dpi, no compression. And I've got stack with original, and I've told it to label it as _working for the files, which you can change here. If you go to edit, you can tell it to append whatever suffix you want, or, you know, whatever. But when you go to Photoshop now, you know, you can do edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. If it doesn't prompt you, then it's probably just going to do that. And then you can, you know, do like a tailoring in here, get it how you want it, do all your dodging, burning. You know, Photoshop's a little more of a surgical tool as opposed to Lightroom, which is, you know, sort of like an immediate care, if you will. But sometimes, I'm just so used to working like this that I will kind of elect to put something flat with Negative Lab Pro and then bring it into Photoshop and sort of tailor it how I want it. And you just have a little more control. So then when you press save, you don't even need to save as, you just press save and it'll do it as _working here. And it brings it back right next to your original. And there you go. And of course, if you have a C print to reference, you can sort of go off of that. If you are looking at a C print, I would definitely have it in the type of light that you intend to display it in, because the color will be largely affected by the color of the light that you're looking at it in. Finally, I just want to show you a comparison between DSLR scans and IMACON scans. And this is only a fraction of the resolution that you can get. I think this is only a 2-shot stitch, so it's pretty similar pixel count to the IMACON. But you can see the DSLR scan on the left just has a little bit more very fine detail. The grain is resolved a little differently, and the skin, the wrinkles on his hand and the cigarette texture is just a little more present. Now you can sharpen the IMACON scan, of course, and that should be part of any printmaking workflow. But basically, if you start off with less detail, you'll never be able to get it to the level that you can with, starting with more. And you can see, of course, the color is a little different. You could tailor each one to look like the other, but I think the DSLR scan right now is a little too contrasty, a little too like cyan or something, but this just takes time and you can perfect it. And that's about it for Negative Lab Pro. There's lots of other features that I didn't go over, and there's really easy ways to sort of batch convert and then go back and edit individual files later. I would encourage you to just make a bunch of virtual copies of some of your negs and just try different settings for each one. There's a lot of subtleties to inversion technique, and just like anything, there really is no perfect way that's going to work every time for every negative. And this is why it's really important to mess around with virtual copies and different inversion methods, different settings for everything, because you'll find you get used to looking at something and you'll think that it's good enough until you see something better. So try dramatic shifts, try dramatic different controls, and you'll sort of shock your eye into seeing something that you didn't see before.